The hangar at Buffalo, New York smelled of oil and aluminum dust the day the prototype first took flight. It was April 1938, and test pilot H. Lloyd Child taxied a strange, blocky monoplane down the Curtiss runway. It didn't look sleek like the European fighters appearing in newsreels from Spain or Germany. Its nose was long, its undercarriage sturdy and fixed. The engineers called it the Curtiss XP-40. Just another experiment in the race to build America's next pursuit plane. When Child opened the throttle, the Allison V-1710 engine roared with a deep, harsh growl. The plane leapt forward, heavy in the nose but eager. In the sky, it was stable, a rock compared to the jittery biplanes it was meant to replace. But when the speed indicator settled at 340 miles per hour, the engineers frowned. Germany's new Messerschmitt Bf-109 was already faster. Britain's prototype Spitfire, faster still. The United States Army Air Corps ordered it anyway. They needed fighters, and Curtiss could build them quickly. It was a stopgap, never meant to be glorious, a weapon to fill the gap until something better arrived. No one knew that this so-called stopgap would still be flying and fighting 6 years later over the sands of Africa. By 1940, Europe was on fire. France had fallen. The Luftwaffe owned the skies from the Channel to Crete. The British Royal Air Force fought desperately to hold them off, and it was running out of airplanes. In London, the Ministry of Aircraft Production looked across the Atlantic for anything that could fly and carry guns. Curtiss, eager to export, offered the P-40 Tomahawk Mark I. It was solid, rugged, easy to maintain. But it was already outdated before it reached the docks. The Allison engine lacked a supercharger, robbing the plane of power above 15,000 feet. Against the Bf-109E, it was slower, climbed worse, and turned poorly. The British pilots who received the first shipment in late 1940 didn't hide their disappointment. "It's like a flying bulldog," one said. "Strong but too heavy to hunt." In Cairo, where the newly formed Royal Air Force Desert Air Force was struggling to hold the line against the Italians in Libya, the situation was desperate. The Spitfire was still months away from deployment in the Middle East. The only fighters available were a handful of Hurricanes and the new, unloved Tomahawks. The No. 112 Squadron RAF, reformed at Helwan near Cairo, received its first P-40s in January 1941. The ground crews baked under the Egyptian sun as they painted desert camouflage over the dark green fuselage. The paint blistered before it dried. Mechanics cursed the sand that clogged the engines and the grit that chewed the propellers. Pilot Officer Peter Wilson, 22 years old, watched the mechanics finish painting shark teeth along the nose of his aircraft. The idea had come from a photograph of a German Bf-110 in Europe, but when the Tomahawks took the air with those snarling jaws, the effect was electric. Even Rommel's men would one day call them the shark-mouthed devils. On February 26, 1941, Wilson and his squadron flew their first combat sortie, an escort for Blenheim bombers heading toward Gambut. The Tomahawks roared low over the desert, their 6 Browning .303s rattling in bursts. The mission went badly. 2 Blenheims were lost, and the P-40s could barely climb fast enough to chase the Italian CR-42s that dove on them. But when one enemy biplane exploded under a burst from Wilson's guns, the pilot knew one thing. The P-40 could take punishment and still bring its pilot home. Back in Germany, the pilots of Jagdschwager 27 laughed when they first heard the Allies were using the Curtiss fighter in Africa. "Too slow," said Oberlieutenant Hans-Joachim Marseille, the young prodigy who would soon be known as the Star of Africa. The Bf-109F could outclimb and outturn it, and Marseille would later prove it, claiming several P-40s in a single day. But those were duels at altitude, the kind the Warhawk was never meant to fight. Down low, hugging the ground where the desert heat shimmered like liquid glass, the P-40 began to show its true character. Its thick wings made it stable. Its radiator, armored and low beneath the nose, could take a hit and keep running. And its Alamein engine, though poor in the thin air above 20,000 feet, was reliable and cool in the thick, hot air of the desert. At the Curtiss factory, one engineer had once called it the last of the Iron Fighters. In North Africa, that was a compliment. The Americans joined the theater late in 1941. The U.S. Army Air Force's 57th Fighter Group, composed of the 64th, 65th, and 66th Fighter Squadron, shipped out from New York that November. Many of the pilots had never seen combat. Lieutenant Jack S. Doyle, a farm boy from Kansas, looked at his P-40 Warhawk on the deck of the carrier USS Chenango and felt both awe and doubt. "They say it's slow, but I'll take slow if it gets me home." The group arrived in Egypt in July 1942, just as Rommel's spearhead was pressing toward Alamein. The desert smelled of dust and aviation fuel, and the sky was never empty. Their British allies at RAF 112 Squadron welcomed them with sand-roughened grins. One ground crewman pointed to the shark teeth on the Tomahawk's nose. He said, "Paint yours like that. Keeps the Jerry nervous." The Americans did. Within weeks, the skies over Mersa Matruh were filled with snarling shark mouths, each one the product of desperation and defiance. At first, the Germans hardly noticed. Rommel's Luftwaffe pilots still considered the P-40 a clumsy intruder. In the bars of Benghazi and Tobruk, they joked that the Americans were sending their scrap metal to die in the desert. But while the Luftwaffe looked upward, the Warhawks were learning to fight downward. In August 1941, a report from the RAF Middle East Command noticed something curious. The P-40, while inferior at high altitude, performs admirably in the ground attack role. Its rugged construction and heavy armament recommend its continued use in the desert. The generals barely noticed the line at the time, but for the men who flew it, that single observation would change everything. Because in the months to come, the desert war would shift from dogfights in the clouds to a brutal low-level struggle for control of the supply lines, the arteries that fed Rommel's Afrika Korps. And when that moment came, the plane no one wanted would finally find the battlefield it was born for.
The sun over Libya was merciless. By mid-morning, the air shimmered like glass, and the desert's heat made the horizon twist and ripple until sky and sand were the same color. From the forward strip at Gamboot near Tobruk, the P-40 Tomahawks of No. 112 Squadron RAF sat half-buried in dust, their shark mouths grinning through the haze. It was the spring of 1942, and the men who flew them were learning, fast, what the desert demanded from a pilot and from a machine. Flight Lieutenant Peter Wilson stood beside his aircraft, the heat radiating through his boots, listening to the engine idle. The Alamein V-1710 hummed like an industrial saw, steady and deep. Around him, ground crew worked bare-chested, refilling .50 caliber belts and patching bullet holes with pieces of tin and canvas. The P-40 wasn't elegant, but it was obedient. It could take punishment and still bring a pilot home even with holes through its wings the size of fists. Their opponents, pilots of JG-27, had arrived in Libya months earlier with new Bf-109 F-4s, sleek and fast. The Germans joked that fighting Tomahawks was target practice with propellers. On paper, they were right. The Messerschmitt could climb 1,500 feet per minute faster and was nearly 60 kilometers per hour quicker. But the desert had a way of leveling differences written on paper. The first lesson came on March 10, 1942. At dawn, 6 Tomahawks from 112 Squadron scrambled to intercept Ju-88 bombers near Gazala. Wilson's flight caught sight of their shadows sliding over the dunes, but before they could dive, 3 Bf-109s dropped out of the sun. Cannon shells ripped past, tearing the air apart. 2 Tomahawks went down almost instantly, their fuel tanks erupting in orange flame.
Wilson shoved the throttle forward and did the one thing the instructors back home had said never to do in a P-40: dive. The heavy fighter tucked its nose down, howling as it dropped below 500 feet. The Germans followed, but at that altitude, the hot air robbed their engines of power. Wilson leveled out a few meters above the sand, kicked the rudder, and the shark-mouthed machine became something else entirely: low, fast, and deadly. The Messerschmitt overshot, and Wilson's 6 Brownings tore into its belly. The Messerschmitt hit the ground in a puff of dust. When he landed, his hands still shaking, the squadron's mechanics counted 43 bullet holes in his plane. The next day, someone painted a tiny shark's fin under the cockpit, a quiet salute to survival. In the weeks that followed, the RAF and their new American allies of the 57th Fighter Group turned the Western Desert into a classroom. They learned the truth about the P-40. It was not a duelist's plane. It was a predator's. Dogfights at altitude were suicide, but at low level, where the air was thick and the sand gave no mercy to a falling aircraft, the P-40 ruled. Its weight and long wings made it rock steady in a dive. Its 6 guns could saw a truck in half. The pilots developed tactics the manuals never mentioned: skip bombing along supply convoys, releasing small bombs that ricocheted into fueled trucks before exploding; hit-and-run sweeps at 100 feet using the rising heat to mask radar detection; and the most effective of all, the boom and zoom, a high-speed dive, a burst of gunfire, and a climb back into the sun before the Germans could react. For the Luftwaffe pilots of JG-27, it was infuriating. They could still win when they caught the Warhawks at altitude, but more and more the enemy refused to play by those rules. At Martuba Airfield, south of Derna, Hauptmann Edward Newman, Group Commander of 1/JG-27, studied reports of fuel convoys burned on the road to Tobruk. He said, always the same: attacked at dawn by these damned shark planes. His pilots laughed, calling them Wüstenschweine, desert pigs, but Newman didn't smile. He knew that for every convoy lost, Rommel's tanks went one day further without petrol. The Warhawks were becoming more than a nuisance. They were beginning to starve an army. By May 1942, the Americans had joined the fight in earnest. The 57th Fighter Group, operating from Mukarakab under Desert Air Command, began flying anti-transport missions along the Via Balbia, the single coastal highway linking Tripoli to the front. Their Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, newer than the RAF Tomahawks, carried extra armor and 2 500-pound bombs under the wings. Lieutenant Jack Doyle wrote home after his first mission: "We flew so low the kyres kicked dust. You could see the faces before you fired. The tracers walked through the trucks like a zipper of fire. They never had a chance." Those convoys were the lifeline of Rommel's Afrika Korps. Every truck destroyed meant one less day of fuel, one less tank that could move. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. Hans Joachim Marseille, already a legend with over 100 victories, took to the air from Ain al-Ghazala to protect the convoys. He shot down P-40s in bunches, often in the same sortie. But even Marseille admitted privately that the Americans and British were learning fast. He said, "They no longer climb to fight. They strike like hawks and vanish." The Germans still held air superiority in numbers, but the nature of the air war was shifting. The P-40s weren't there to win duels, they were there to cut arteries. By June, the lessons were written in flame across the desert. A single day's report from the Desert Air Force, June 14, 1942, listed 58 enemy trucks destroyed near Sidi Barrani, 16 damaged, 8 aircraft lost to flak. The majority of the sorties were flown by P-40s. That same week, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel prepared his advance toward El Alamein. His staff warned him that fuel supplies were dangerously low. He said, "We'll take it from the British." But the British, flying low in those squat American fighters, were already taking it from him. At the end of one long day in July, Peter Wilson and Jack Doyle sat on the wing of a sand-scarred Warhawk at LG-92, watching the sunset bleed over the dunes. The aircraft was riddled with bullet holes, the shark mouth half burned away by exhaust. Peter asked, "You still think it's a dog?" Doyle laughed and said, "No, it's a bulldog, and this desert's full of bones." They were dirty, exhausted, and outnumbered, but the desert had taught them something the factories and flight schools never could. War wasn't about the prettiest airplane or the highest climb rate. It was about endurance, machines that could take a beating, and pilots who refused to quit. The P-40 had found its classroom in the sand.
and its students were about to teach the Afrika Korps a lesson they would never forget.
The summer of 1942 turned the North African desert into a furnace. By day, the sand could melt the soles of a man's boots. By night, the cold sliced through flight jackets like a knife. The war here wasn't just fought between armies. It was fought between logistics and geography, between convoys and time. Whoever controlled the flow of fuel controlled the desert. For Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, that lifeline was the Via Balbia, the thin black ribbon of coastal road that stretched from Tripoli to the front. Along it, every day, rumbled hundreds of trucks, Nachschubkolonnen, carrying the blood of the army, petrol, ammunition, rations, spare parts. But by the summer of 42, the desert no longer belonged to Rommel's supply men. It belonged to the Warhawk. From a forward landing ground near El Daba, the 57th Fighter Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces began a campaign that would strangle the Afrika Korps' lifeline. Their Curtiss P-40E and F Warhawks, painted in mottled tan and brown, shark teeth grinning under the noses, flew in pairs and trios at dawn, skimming the dunes so low that the wingtips kicked dust. Lieutenant Jack Doyle, 64th Fighter Squadron, adjusted his oxygen mask as the first light broke over the horizon. Ahead of him, the lead pilot called out, "Convoy, 2 o'clock low." The line of trucks was barely visible through the morning haze, a thin string of black dots snaking along the coastal track west of Sidi Barrani. Doyle's squadron dove from 500 feet. At 300 miles per hour, the ground rushed up like a wall. He toggled the bomb release. 2 500-pounders fell free and tumbled through the heat shimmer, then exploded in a column of fire and sand. The trucks erupted one by one, a chain of orange blossoms blooming across the desert. The radio crackled with laughter and static. "Hit! Hit! Keep it low!" Within minutes, the entire convoy was burning. German drivers ran for cover as machine gun tracers stitched the sand. Doyle pulled up hard, the Warhawk shuddering under the strain. He looked down and saw the road vanish into black smoke. Back at El Daba, the ground crew counted the bullet holes in his wings and patched them with tin and tape. The paint blistered, the exhaust left streaks of soot down the fuselage, but the P-40 kept flying. That same day, British intelligence recorded 23 trucks and 4 fuel tankers destroyed, just one sortie among hundreds. At Afrika Korps HQ near Mirza Matruh, Rommel paced in silence. "Another convoy lost," reported his supply officer, Oberst Klaus von der Heyde. "They came at dawn, from the sun, always the same." Rommel frowned. "What fighters?" "Those American ones, with the shark's mouth." Rommel didn't laugh. He said, "They're learning," quietly. By July, the Desert Air Force had turned its air power into a weapon of attrition. RAF squadrons, number 112, 250, 260, 450 RAF, coordinated with the Americans of the 57th Group. They operated in loose formations called fighter-bomber sweeps, attacking roads, depots, and columns moving through the open desert. Unlike the high-altitude dogfights over Europe, this was a brutal, personal kind of air war. Pilots could see the faces of the men they attacked, truck drivers leaping from cabs, mechanics diving under burning vehicles. The smell of smoke and fuel filled the cockpits. At El Adem, just south of Tobruk, RAF pilot Neville Duke led his section on a low-level strike against a German supply column. His P-40, code letter GA-D, roared down the highway at treetop height. The Brownings hammered, 750 rounds in less than 10 seconds. A fuel truck exploded, sending debris clattering against his fuselage. Duke pulled up and glanced at his wingman. "Bloody hell, these things are tougher than they look." Far to the west at Benghazi, German pilot Hans Joachim Marcel of GG-27 prepared to intercept the raiders. He was already a legend, the star of Africa, with over 150 victories. When he met the P-40s at altitude, he tore them apart. In a single day, September 1st, 1942, he shot down 17 Allied aircraft in 3 sorties, mostly P-40s. But for every Warhawk that fell in combat, 10 more went after Rommel's supply line. Even Marcel's brilliance couldn't guard the road from the sky forever. The Luftwaffe was stretched thin. Its fuel convoys were being destroyed faster than replacements could arrive. For every gallon that reached Rommel's tanks, 3 were burning in the desert. The impact was immediate. At the front lines near El Alamein, German panzer divisions reported that less than 30% of requested fuel was arriving. Mechanics drained trucks to fill tanks. Officers hoarded the last reserves for withdrawal. British intelligence calculated that by August 1942, the Luftwaffe and Afrika Korps were receiving only half the supplies they had 2 months earlier. Ultra intercepts from Bletchley confirmed it. Rommel's convoys were collapsing under constant air attack. Rommel himself wrote to the OKW in Berlin, "Our fuel losses to enemy air action are unsustainable. Every movement is known to the British. We cannot hold Egypt without control of the air." He was right, but control of the air was already slipping away. In Cairo, Air Vice Marshal Arthur Conyngham, commander of the Desert Air Force, reviewed the daily strike reports. In 1 week, July 25th to 31st, his P-40 units had destroyed or damaged over 400 Axis vehicles between Tobruk and Fuka. "Gentlemen," he told his staff, "the lifeline is bleeding out. Keep the pressure up." And so they did. Every morning, before dawn, the Warhawks roared off the sand. They came from Egypt, from Libya, from rough landing grounds carved out of the dunes. They hunted convoys like predators, their shadows sliding across the desert floor. The German radio operators nicknamed them Wüstengeister, desert ghosts. On August 22, 1942, the 64th Fighter Squadron of the 57th Group spotted one of the largest convoys yet, over 50 vehicles moving near Sidi Hanaishi. The Americans attacked in waves, each dive punctuated by gunfire and explosions. When they returned, they were sunburned, deafened, and exhilarated. That night, a captured German soldier told his interrogators, "The sharks come at sunrise. We call them de Tod von oben, death from above." By September, the results were visible even from orbiting reconnaissance planes. The once busy road from Bengali to Tobruk was littered with burned wrecks, hundreds of black scars stretching for miles. At the front, Rommel's tanks sat idle, their fuel drums empty. Mechanics cannibalized broken trucks to build makeshift trailers, towing them with horses. The Axis war machine in Africa was still dangerous, still disciplined, but it was running on fumes. Literally. For the Warhawk pilots, the Desert War had changed them forever. They no longer fought for glory or dogfight tallies. Their mission was practical, brutal, and essential. Destroy supply, deny fuel, break momentum. One evening, as the sun sank behind the dunes, Jack Doyle wrote in his journal, "They used to laugh at our planes, said they were too heavy, too slow. But today, Rommel's tanks are sitting still, and our slow planes made that happen. Maybe that's fast enough." By the time autumn arrived, the Axis war machine in Africa was gasping for air. And when Montgomery finally struck at El Alamein in October, the Warhawks were already there, circling above, engines growling, ready to finish the job they had started. Rommel's convoys were gone. His lifeline was cut. The desert itself had turned against him, and the P-40 Warhawk had drawn the blade.
The night before El Alamein, the desert was silent. The wind had dropped, and the stars hung motionless over the dunes like frozen sparks. Far behind the British lines, the airfields of the Desert Air Force were alive with quiet movement. Mechanics tightening bolts, refueling tanks, checking gun harmonization under the faint light of hurricane lamps. Among the ranks of aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip, the P-40 Warhawks waited, their shark mouths glinting faintly under the moon. At LG-91 near Alamein, Lieutenant Jack Doyle leaned against his Warhawk, writing a letter home to Kansas. He could hear the distant rumble of artillery preparations, the first growl of what would soon become one of the most decisive battles of the war. "We're going in tomorrow," he wrote. "If this works, maybe the desert will finally be ours." The aircraft around him carried the scars of months of fighting.
Sandblasted noses, patched wings, exhaust streaks that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Yet every engine would start in the morning. Every one would fly. At 9:40 p.m. on October 23, 1942, the British Eighth Army opened fire. From the coast to the Katara Depression, 900 artillery pieces thundered at once. The ground trembled as if the desert itself had awakened. The Axis front line, stretched thin, out of fuel and half-starved, shuddered under the bombardment. Above them in the night sky, the first P-40s began to circle. The Warhawk pilots of the 57th Fighter Group and the RAF squadrons, number 11, 250, 260, and 450 RAAF, flew under a new system known as the cab rank. Instead of waiting for orders from headquarters, pairs of fighter bombers loitered in orbit above the front. When ground units spotted a target, they radioed the nearest aircraft, who dived instantly to strike. It was close air support before the term existed. Doyle's flight, Red Section 64 Squadron, was called in at dawn on October 24, 1942. The target, a line of German trucks moving near Tel El Akakir. The Warhawks came in low, the morning sun behind them. Doyle toggled his bomb release at 300 feet. His two 500-pounders hit squarely in the middle of the convoy, engulfing the road in fire. He pulled up, rolled inverted, and saw the entire column burning end to end. His wingman, Lieutenant George T. Ayers, strafed the survivors with .550 caliber fire, the heavy rounds kicking up sand like fountains. "Good hits," he shouted over the radio. "Looks like they won't be needing lunch today." By mid-morning, the radio traffic from Axis forward units was in chaos. Rommel's front line was unraveling, not only from Montgomery's ground assault, but from the relentless attacks from above. On the second day of the battle, the Australians and New Zealanders broke through the southern minefields. To their left, the South African 1st Division pressed forward under air cover. Flying Officer Peter Wilson of 102 Squadron described what he saw in his combat report. Continuous smoke columns visible on the coast road. Enemy tanks moving northwest in retreat. Engaged at 50 feet. Strikes observed on leading vehicles. For 3 days, the Warhawks flew nearly without rest. 6-7 sorties a day. Ground crews worked barefoot in the sand to rearm them, their uniforms stiff with sweat and dust. The airfield revetments echoed with engines as one flight landed while another took off. Fuel shortages were now crippling Rommel. Reports from captured prisoners told the same story again and again. Tanks abandoned for lack of petrol, artillery left behind, convoys ambushed from the air. "The sky belongs to the sharks," one prisoner said bitterly. At Afrika Korps HQ, Rommel was at the end of his tether. He had returned from Germany just in time to witness the collapse. On October 29th, his chief of staff handed him another signal. Petrol for 24 hours operation remaining. No possibility of resupply. Rommel stared at it for a long moment, then folded it silently. "Without fuel, we are nothing," he said. He wasn't wrong. The war that had begun with lightning-fast blitzkrieg now ended in slow motion. Engines sputtering, tanks stranded in the sand, aircraft grounded for lack of aviation spirit. The Afrika Korps, once a storm of steel and speed, was now a skeleton. For the Warhawk pilots, victory had a strange taste. On November 2nd, Montgomery launched Operation Supercharge, the final push. Doyle's squadron was tasked with clearing retreating columns near Fuka. They came in from the sea at 150 feet, firing short, precise bursts. Doyle's bullets ripped through the radiator of a Panzer III. The tank lurched sideways and burst into flames. He pulled up just in time to see the battlefield spread beneath him. Hundreds of vehicles, smoke plumes twisting like black serpents. The Warhawks flew in groups of 4, their shadows racing across the dunes. "Keep your eye on the road," his flight leader barked. "Nothing moves today unless it's ours." By nightfall, El Alamein was over. Rommel's army was in full retreat toward Libya, leaving 30,000 men and nearly all of their heavy equipment behind. After the battle, the pilots gathered in their mess tent, drinking tea gone lukewarm in the desert air. They were too tired to celebrate. Peter Wilson wrote in his logbook, "Flown 9 sorties in 36 hours. Aircraft riddled. No one killed. Desert quiet again."
For a brief, fragile moment, the skies over Egypt belonged entirely to the Allies. The P-40s now hunted the retreat. In November and December 1942, they followed Rommel's columns westward across the Egyptian-Libyan border, striking at fuel dumps near Mersa Brega, convoys around Aguila, and airfields hastily abandoned by the Luftwaffe. Every sortie was another cut to the arteries of the Axis war machine. At El Gagila, the 57th Fighter Group's after-action report recorded 63 enemy vehicles destroyed by P-40 bomb and gunfire, minimal opposition, enemy movement disorganized. By the time the year ended, the Afrika Korps was barely holding Tunisia. The desert that had once carried them forward now buried them inch by inch. At dawn on December 31, 1932, Jack Doyle walked to the edge of the runway at LG-174 near Marble Arch, Libya. The air was cool for once, and the horizon shimmered with the first light of a new year. His P-40 sat behind him, patched and dirty, but alive. He thought of all the names painted on the sides of planes, lost to flak, to engine fire, to bad luck. He thought of the German pilots who once called them junk and laughed at their heavy American machines. They weren't laughing now. Above him, a formation of Warhawks thundered into the dawn, shark mouths open wide, the sound of their engines echoing across the dunes. He smiled faintly. The desert was no longer Rommel's. It was theirs. In less than 6 months, the P-40 had gone from being dismissed as obsolete to becoming the backbone of air supremacy in North Africa. It didn't win by being beautiful or fast. It won by being there, every day, at every altitude where the war was actually fought. When the desert finally turned, it wasn't the tanks or the generals that broke the Axis supply line. It was the roar of 6 Brownings over the Via Balbia, the voice of a machine the enemy never took seriously until it was too late. When 1943 began, the war in North Africa was nearly over. The once unstoppable Deutsches Afrika Korps was broken and retreating westward toward Tunisia, chased by British, Australian, and American forces that seemed to own the desert skies. The P-40 Warhawk, mocked as outdated just a year before, was now the constant shadow above every road Rommel's men tried to use. From the makeshift airfields around Tripoli, the 57th Fighter Group flew mission after mission, their worn Warhawks patched with desert dust and bullet holes. Mechanics joked that the planes were more sand than steel, yet somehow they kept flying. The Allison V-1710 engines still roared, the 6 Brownings still barked, and the shark mouths still opened wide every morning. The last push in Tunisia. In February 1943, the Allies crossed into southern Tunisia. The Warhawks moved with them, leapfrogging from one captured airfield to another. Elassa, Thilept, Mareth, Gabes. Always just close enough to reach the Axis supply columns trying desperately to flee north. The Luftwaffe, now reduced to a handful of Bf-109 G2s and FW-190As, fought bravely but hopelessly. Fuel shortages meant that German fighters often couldn't even take off. Their airfields were bombed daily, and every truck that carried aviation fuel risked ambush by low-flying P-40s. On March 19, 1943, during the Battle of the Mareth Line, the 64th Fighter Squadron struck a fuel dump near Medellin. Lieutenant Jack Doyle led the attack from 200 feet. "Target in sight," he radioed. "Fuel drums, hundreds of them." His bombs hit dead center. The explosion shook the entire desert, sending a black column of smoke 2,000 feet into the air. The fire burned for 2 days. That night, captured German reports recorded, "No fuel for tanks tomorrow. Supply destroyed by American fighter bombers." The Warhawks had done what they were built for, turning mobility into paralysis, engines into silence. The enemy's admiration. In the spring of 1943, with Tunisia surrounded, JG-27, the Luftwaffe fighter wing that had once laughed at the Curtiss machine, made its final sorties from Tunis Eloina. The great ace Hans Joachim Marseille was already dead, killed in a bailout accident that previous September. But his comrades still spoke of his respect for the Allied pilots. Herr Marseille once told me, recalled Oberlieutenant Franz Stigler, that the P-40 is no toy. In the right hands, it's a lion. Now those words seemed prophetic. German prisoners captured in April spoke the same way. One sergeant simply said, "When we see the shark mouth, we stop the truck and run." Rommel himself, writing from his hospital bed in Germany, admitted in a letter to his wife, "Our defeat in Africa was sealed not by tanks, but by airplanes, especially those American machines that hunted our convoys without rest. They cut us to pieces." Tunisia falls. By May 1943, the end came swiftly. Axis convoys, once proud columns of supply, now lay shattered along the roads. In their last days, the Afrika Korps was reduced to burning its own fuel stores to prevent capture. On May 12th, radio intercepts from Bletchley Park reported the final message from Africa. "We will fight to the end. Long live Germany." Hours later, 230,000 Axis soldiers surrendered. At the airfields near Tunis, the P-40s taxied in and shut down their engines for the last time in Africa. Mechanics climbed onto the wings and patted the hot cowling as if greeting an old friend. These aircraft had survived sand, flak, heat, and exhaustion, and had done something no one believed possible. They had turned the tide of a continental war. After the desert. The Warhawks' journey didn't end in Africa. From 1943 onward, new models, P-40K, M, N, served in Italy, China, Burma, India, and the South Pacific. In every theater, they filled the same role: reliable, rugged, everywhere. In China, General Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers had already made the shark-mouth world famous. In Italy, the same design reappeared on the noses of the 79th Fighter Group, supporting Allied troops through Sicily and Salerno. In the Pacific, Australian and New Zealand pilots called their P-40s Kitty Hawks and swore by their durability. But to the men who had flown them first, those who learned to fight in the North African heat, the P-40 would always belong to the desert. The technical legacy. Historians later dismissed the P-40 as second-rate, but engineers knew better. Its Allison V1710 engine proved nearly indestructible in hot climates. Its self-sealing fuel tanks and armored radiator allowed it to survive hits that would destroy lighter fighters. The thick wing, once criticized for drag, made it rock-steady in dives and lethal in ground attack. Most importantly, it was available in huge numbers when nothing else was. Between 1939 and 1944, over 13,700 P-40s were built, more than any other American fighter until the P-51 Mustang. When future aircraft designers studied the P-40's combat record, they learned a lesson that would shape the next generation of warplanes. Reliability wins wars. The men behind the machine. After the war, Peter Wilson returned to England, quietly teaching flight navigation to new RAF recruits. He rarely spoke about the desert, though a faded photo of his shark-mouthed Tomahawk hung in his study until he died in 1978. Jack Doyle came home to Kansas in 1945. He ran a small airfield and told young pilots the same thing every time they complained about their planes. It doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to come home. Many of their comrades never did. The cemeteries from El Alamein to Tunis are full of names carved in white stone, men who fought in machines that history almost forgot. A soldier's epilogue. Decades later, an aging German veteran visited the El Alamein War Museum. Standing before a restored P-40 in its tan desert camouflage, he touched the metal gently. "We used to laugh at these," he said to a guide. "But when they came, we knew we were finished." The guide nodded. They did their job. The old man smiled faintly. "Too well," he whispered. Final reflection.
In the deserts of North Africa, speed didn't matter. Grace didn't matter. What mattered was endurance, the ability to take punishment, to keep flying, to strike again and again until the enemy could no longer move. The P-40 Warhawk embodied that spirit. It wasn't the fastest or the most glamorous, but it was there when the world needed it, flown by men who learned to turn disadvantages into victory. The desert remembered them. The roar of Alamein engines at sunrise, the flash of gunfire over endless dunes, the shark mouth grinning down through the smoke. When the last echoes of war faded, one truth remained, carved in the sand of history. In the North African desert, the P-40 Warhawk, the plane they laughed at, cut the arteries of an empire and proved that courage and persistence could make even an underdog a legend.